second panel of the day. And we're going to be reflecting on something that concerns us all here and concerns Loop first and foremost, which is the relationship between different moving image-based formats and forms of collecting. We are having a panel moderated by Gabriela Galcerán, who I thank immensely for accepting this challenge. Gabriela has been a long-time friend, companion of Loop, and it made particular sense within this context. We will have as speakers Sandra Terdjman, Daniela Zyman, Manuel Segade, who need no introductions. In case you need a bit of refreshment of who they are, their bios are really nicely written in the last page of our booklet. Beatrice Bulgari, who was meant to be in the panel, is unwell. She has an otitis, so unfortunately we cannot have her with us. Last year we had a very generous and comprehensive talk by Leonardo Bigazzi, who's actually here, who is running In Between Art Film, the platform created by Beatrice Bulgari. And, but as we had from the experience of the previous panel, maybe 3 speakers is actually much more than enough, and especially when we have such incredible voices. So yes, let's start. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Filipa, and thank you, Loop, for having us here, and to all of you, because this is just turning into an endurance marathon. Just note is that I think that we are very fortunate to have 3 organizations that they share and approach their care into the way they collect in very different ways, which is Kadist is a decentralized, artist-based project. We have TBA 21, which has ecology in the widest sense of the word, that binds together all the programming and commissioning and enterprises that they do. And then finally we have big national museum with all its implications and responsibilities that holds. So I think it's very varied, but they all share challenges and dilemmas. So we would like to start maybe with Sandra, and off you go.
Yes. Does it work? Yes. And I'm also the responsible of the computer.
Very important.
Very important role. Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation. The title, Collecting as a Form of Caring, was the title I had in my mind thinking about the panel and reflecting on the word caring to start. I thought it may be a good term for me in the past, in the last years, caring for an artwork, caring for an artist's practice, caring for an artist's process. But today I feel a bit less worried about caring, and what's in my mind is a bit more responsibility, which was back to the question of the panel before. So more collecting as a form of responsibility. I guess I'm getting older, and really starting a bit more to think of Kadist as an artist-centric organization. To really an organization that also focuses on audiences. So not only how art is made, but what does it do really to people, and how. So this is what I think will drive us in the coming years, this sort of shift of perspective. But a bit back of a bit of info on Kadist for the ones who are not familiar. And I have a slideshow. I have 3 images. Sorry. So Kadist, as Gabriela said, we are a international decentralized organization. We're a non-profit. It says Kadist, Paris and San Francisco. Paris and San Francisco are 2 offices in a way. We have a venue in Paris where we have exhibitions. and residencies and our office, but really the core of what Kadist does is to be seen in, I would say, 15 different places in the world on a yearly basis. The core of the program is based on collaboration with different entities. They go from artist-run space to national museums. And we basically think ourselves as a resource for artists and for those spaces, for curators on an international basis. And Kadist holds a collection, which was both the starting point and something that it will be probably the end point of Kadist. It's an ever-growing amount of works that we care for. We have today about 2,500 works. Many of them are media video-based, so I would say 40%, which is why we came to Loop from the early days. We started collecting in the early 2000s. We started collecting video art really at its beginning, and are continuing. So it's this ever-growing entity, the collection, that we work with. I think I have, a mission statement even. A mission statement that really means currently in my head and for us that art has two functions for us. One is a tool for advocacy. One would be a tool for dialogue. Which I hold on those two terms because of the current world we live in. It feels like very much needed. Advocacy because of the power of art, we believe, to really transform and shift perspective, bring awareness on social issues. Most of the collection is really driven by artists who address key social issues in their work. And so working with a collection is working with a set of ideas, a set of perspective on the world. And when we travel with the collection through a show, our aim is to create a number of programming that are dialogues, workshops, events. So there's never really a static show. It's often a show and a set of moments for conversation and debate. I think I said that. And I'm going to go directly to the core of the conversation, which is what do we do with what we call our video library? So again, how do we become the collection as a form of responsibility was for me to say, how do we become more and more public? How do we become more and more, not like Reina Sofia, but holding the responsibility for this collection to be seen as much as possible. And we don't have, as I said, we don't have a museum space, or collection is not on view all the time. But I think we're about 5% today of the collection being shown on a yearly basis, and our aim is to double that. And the way we want to be public is in two ways. One is building this video library, which is accessible now online. It's called Kadist TV. We've been talking about it, to be honest, for quite some time, but it's finally looking like something you should all look at. It has about 700 entries. 500 of them are video artist films that can be streamed. So you can access them, obviously, with their authorization. Many of them are films of our collection, but not only. Some of them are licenses of artists, which I will speak about. In this library, you can also see, there's channels, so there's a lot of editorial work being done, so it's become a repertoire, to go back to the previous panel, so it's more editorialized through themes. But otherwise, it's pretty much of a big database. And there's a lot of interviews. We've started making artist interviews of the collection since 2005. I came across a video of Mario Garcia Torres talking about his work from 20 years old. So there's 160 interviews of artists. It's pretty, a really important resource today. and artists talking about their artwork. And to go back to the idea of the licenses, so as I say, we acquire video works, but we also license some. So what does that mean? When an artist has already, where we bought a work of an artist, we also propose to some to buy the right to show it on this platform, to buy the right for 20 years. And therefore for us to be able to work with a bigger set of one artist's practice and to be able to, work with this, to editorialize better the practice of an artist. And today we have, about, again, another hundreds of licenses. So artists who said yes to be part on this platform, which means we buy it for 10% of an acquisition price to be able to just show it on the platform. And when we present the film in a venue, in a real public physical space, then we have artist fee on top. So this is what I brought, I think, to Loop some years ago as a concept, which became very controversial. So let's see today how people feel about that. It certainly was a bit conceptual initially, but now that the Kadist TV exists and now that there's really people using it, I feel artists really see the potential, educational potential of that. So I guess I will end on that, or maybe last thing. The way I see the publicness of our video collection, so one is the video library, which is pretty much for this kind of audience that are professionals, artists, researchers, curators. But then when we show films in a public space, then we're hopefully reaching out to a larger audience. So I just wanted to end on this double takes program, which is the core of our, one of the core of our, annual program, where we use the video collection as a way to show in cinemas, in artist-run spaces, and these are three examples. One is that were happening in the past 5 months, I think. One was a film festival in Mexico. We had a one-day screening. One is a 3 months viewing room in an artist-run space called Simian in Copenhagen. And the last one is taking on and happening now in Dakar at the French Institute. So it's a proper cinema room. So again, to go back to the first panel, I think yesterday, we're constantly in collaboration with different type of venues to make the circulation possible. That's it. And commissioning is part of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandra. And I've already seen you writing down furiously, taking notes, so maybe Daniela would like to take it up.
I have to take notes because I'm such an admirer of Kadist. So their practice has always been the guiding star in the darkness. Well, thank you for having me. I am a curator and I am the artistic director of TBA21. And just a few words about TBA21. It is a foundation that has really multiple, somebody was saying arms of an octopus, yes. And one part is a collection, a substantial collection of contemporary art. It is the collection that was initiated and put together and is nurtured by Francesca Thyssen-Bornemisza, really in the tradition of her father and her grandfather. And here in Spain, I don't have to point out the Thyssen Museum in Madrid because it is such a national treasure and institution. So it is this idea of the continuation within sort of a collection dynasty, if you want, that is also sort of cemented in the idea of TBA21. But beyond that, and especially in the last decade and a half, TBA has evolved, maybe that's the word, into an organization that is very much centered on critical ecologies, on the oceans, on creating knowledge, awareness, and advocacy for the oceans through the arts, through science, through different programs. And also extremely engaged in this question of what is pedagogy today, right? What is engaged, practical, applied pedagogy, organismo. I have my colleague Eduardo here and other members of the team who have been thinking very, very deeply about this question of recollectivizing, right? How to create not just publics, but actually communities of knowledge, of care, and of investigation around not only the sort of artistic practices of today, but our sort of being in the world. But we are talking about collecting, so I'll focus sort of my notes on collection, and with all my enthusiasm and great also fascination for collecting, I still want to bring in a few prompts that might perhaps kind of... Well, you know, we need to sort of agitate a little bit, no? The waters in the room, perhaps. So I'm by no means dismissive by trying to sort of introduce a few ideas, but as you will sort of see, it also is a way of thinking ecologically about collecting that sort of drives a few ideas that I'm going to present. But firstly, since it is about caring, and there's always something that has extremely fascinated me about the word care, which is its etymology. And its etymology both in English, also in Spanish, as I understand, but certainly in German, which is my native language, interestingly, comes from anxiety, comes from worry, comes from actually an emotion that suggests instability and destabilization. And in German, in fact, the same word, even today, right? In English, it's like care and careful, right? So it's a bit more hidden, let's say, through the history of concept. In German, it's still the same word, Sorge und Sorgen, right? The same word that means to care for, to attend, to make sure. Sorry, is that working, or is this, am I being very active? So I should not move. Are you trying to say okay, I'll try to be more like Egyptian, more Egyptian according to Caroline. Okay, Egyptian paradigm. So back to this caring and worrying. So I want to keep this sort of agitation and worrying in addressing the sort of particular relationship or the relationship of intimacy that collecting kind of brings about, which is one very often framed by possession, right? Possession literally means, you know, what we care for are the objects, in this case, the works of art, that we own and that create a relationship of ownership, of possession, a politics of intimacy framed by a culture that values possession, clearly, right? Not all cultures value possessions. Not all culture, and again, I'm kind of building on some of the thoughts Caroline, but Caroline has said everything, so it's clearly. But I'm building on that idea that this framing of collecting as a way of possessing objects also objectifies works of art, right? It reifies them. There's sort of maybe like a more Marxist idea, and this idea of work as labor, the artwork as the product of labor. But that idea we have also dropped a little bit, although in the use of the word works of art, we still sort of have that notion of the congelation of labor. But what we see more and more is this sort of, as I said, the politics of intimacy framed as the relationship of possession, which actually creates an ontological status of the work of art as an object, yeah? rather than something that is overcoming the dialectic relationship between object and subject, between living matter and dead matter, between sort of something that has its own sort of, let's say, spiritual or living nature, and something that is considered something that can be stored and archived and is going sort of into the realms of objecthood, you know, through this encasing of the collection. And to me, this is something that is kind of substantially important also in the way we conserve, and conservation, obviously, is the sort of second extremely important element relating to the practice of caring and caring for collections. And conservation as historic preservation, nature conservation, very much framed, again, by a different framing. So it's not the framing, the transactional framing that we have in a collection as possession. It's a more idealistic framing, because it sort of always returns to this idea of the authentic, of the pure, of the original, of we have to conserve a work, we have to conserve a piece of nature into sort of an isolated realm where it is not disturbed by the noise of the world, right? Where we can actually, with the best knowledge of science and applying, all the conservation practices that we have, we can make sure that things are safeguarded for posterity. But in some ways, sculptures also die, and Ares Negris Marquet. They also actually have a life, right? So coming back to this idea of the de-objectifying of the work of art or the filmic work, I know you remembered me that it's more about film, especially with filmic works, with artist cinema. So in a way, again, we have created a framework, and obviously the museum is sort of the palace, no, of this idea of both creating forms of encounters, but also of these sort of practices of conservation. So I think, in some ways, where I want to go with these remarks is we need to sort of again remember that specifically moving images, video art, right, has come out of the desire of disrupt objecthood, right? Of actually very strong intention by many of the artists of the sort of 60s avant-garde, right? To create something that circulates more freely, that is available throughout different means, throughout different media, where actually these types of framings that are transactional, ontological, institutional, are perhaps not necessary, because the tools of production can be socialized, can be sort of defined differently. Yeah? And what I also find very interesting, and I'll stop here, just throwing a few bits and pieces out there. What I find interesting is what we see more and more again resurging today are initiatives by artists to actually create institutions that work differently, that work in areas that are perhaps underserved in terms of sort of institutional infrastructures, where in fact their own funds, their own possibilities, their own sort of economies, right, flow into creating artist institutions that are like Ito Baradas, no? For instance, one of the examples, but also Saudat Ismailova, who's created sort of an archive of Uzbek film, and many other examples. And I've been talking to quite a few artists as of late, no? Who are exactly going into this idea of recreating institutions, formats, places of learning, of conservation, of distribution that function. Otobong, for instance, yeah, like just kind of came to my mind, no? That function differently. A lot of them also with a strong sort of ecological idea, where sort of Renzo, yeah, where bringing kind of ecological practice in synchronization with artistic practice and conservation, not along the line of conserving for eternity, but bringing it back to life. Eh? And there is this very, very beautiful definition by John Tronto about what care is, and with that I might finish. And I could look it up. I have my notes here, but I'm not going to do that. But basically, what she says is like, care are all the activities we perform to maintain and repair the world. Not the world as one world, but the world as many worlds, right? The idea of repairing the worlds, repairing the history. So caring, right, as reparation, both reparation of historical wrong, but reparation also of recreating multiplicities and possibilities of interaction, of distribution, of engagement that work differently and that create other possibilities of both engaging with art and moving art or moving image art and our society. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniela. I think that you've just touched upon the care in the sense of how the relations and interconnections work, and which I hope we have time later on to expand. And Manuel, I think that now, after all you've just heard, are you ready?
Sure. Thank you, Loop. Thank you, Filipa, and thank you, Gabriela, for this. And I'm really happy to share so much tentacularity with Sandra and Daniela. But I will try to follow my notes, not like you, because if not, I will make another Caroline, and it's like a way of caring in another sense, no? In a case of a public institution as big as you were saying, Gabriela, as Reina Sofia Museum, I think transparency is precisely a good way to start caring, no? So to really tell you a little bit, which is the frame we are working in, precisely thinking about moving image in the museum. No? We're in a moment of transition, reorganizing the spatial narrative of the museum itself, physically speaking, that is already big enough, physically speaking. And we think really we need precisely order in a really, really clear way, like in the labyrinth the museum is for the visitors right now, no? And the unkindness of the buildings themselves. So we are working a lot precisely in how, the people need to move, the people need to encounter, and the people, we have a museum that is really weird because I think it's the only huge as this one of this size in the world that has not a hall. You cannot receive the people in any place in our museum. So these are challenges that really produce, ways of thinking the spaces in another way. I mean, it's to produce order to let the artist to precisely the order it in the future. No? So in this sense, moving image or artist cinema, video art, whatever you want to call it, we are precisely thinking, giving it a clear space in the museum itself, physically, no? Because we all know that the specific conditions of production and exhibiting this kind of material in a, for example, old building like a hospital from the 17th century, sound is an issue. Rubber is an issue. The conditions of sitting and having the time, no, takes a lot of energy. So precisely when I arrived at the museum, there was a refurbishment of the old auditorium of this old hospital building by Eugeni Bach, a Catalan architect, precisely. That was, in a way, restoring the works of the 89 made in that, this kind of really postmodern scenography of our cinema. So it became now the cinema of the museum, and in front of it there is a room, Espacio Uno, that I'm sure all the people here remembers because it was the emergent practices space since the mid-90s, I think, no? Since Pepe Guirao, at least in the museum. So these two spaces will be like our two rooms precisely dedicated to moving image in a lot of different ways. New media, if you prefer to expand it in another sense. But this is really, really important for us because, it gives us a space precisely to deal with production, to deal with exhibition, and precisely to deal with other ways of producing that have to do with discursive patterns, studies, other fields that precisely, our commitment is not precisely to have a cinema and exhibit cinema because, we are next to the National Spanish Film Library, the Filmoteca, it's just almost next door to our building. We share audiences with them. But this is not the way, we want to make premieres of things that never can happen in a commercial room in our field, but it's not that way. Precisely we want a place where we can discuss and generate other kinds of discursive productions around what moving image is by itself. No, so this is the opening of the program we will open, because we already have relations with different festivals, international, in Toronto, in Marseille. I mean, cinema is already in the center of the practices of our public programs, because our let's say chief of public programs, in a sense, Chema, that maybe is precisely a person specialized in cinema. So the museum in the last 15 years always had that commitment to cinema itself. But we want to open up what cinema needs to be in the museum. No, this commitment with production opens up to different lines. No, precisely in this espacio uno, in this physical space for artist cinema. One is the production that we want to make every year and a half, more or less, dealing precisely with something that was also a tradition in the museum. We are precisely negotiating how to keep traditions that are selective and really interesting for us in the future of the museum. And one of them, maybe you remember Albert Serra made an edition of his, a special edition of one of his films, The Libertine, before making the film, as an installation in Reina Sofia. So this is one pattern that is interesting for us, and we were working for the last year with Oliver Lasche, precisely, that is opening a new rereading of materials shoot in the Middle East, preparing Sirat, and of the film Sirat, in the museum in an installation that we will open as a kind of a dance floor in 17th of December, so just right now. This will be one of these new productions, and we think it's about how cinema can be specialized in the spaces. But also, I'm interested in talking about this too. We just closed a deal, a convention with Han Nefken's foundation, that I'm sure is really well known in this room, precisely to produce one of these moving image commissions, a new one, with the Singapore Museum and the Walker Center of Minneapolis and Reina Sofia, precisely to make one of these commissions of $100,000 to an artist to produce a cinema piece, let's say, for the exhibition spaces of the three places, and with the aim also to have one of the editions of this piece in the three collections, not the three museums, not in Han Nefken's ones. So I think it's a really important way of understanding how we can deal also with with commissions in the future. The third line that we are preparing for this space is precisely how to recontextualize or rethink cinema pieces that are already in the collection of the museum. No, maybe more historical, maybe less, but museums. You were talking about this, this ecosystem, and sometimes you feel a lack of ecosystem, like the voracity of museums buying things and then never using them, and we are rethinking precisely, how we should display a lot of these materials that are not, that artists maybe are alive and we can work with them, and sounds like weird, but in a museum like ours, our conservators are not used to work with alive artists. That is really curious and peculiar. No? So at the same time, we are. I will put an example about these ways of working with the collection, because we are preparing in February next year. We are presenting a new chapter of the collection from the 70s until the present, the last 50 years, in one floor of the last floor, the fourth floor of the hospital building, and. Precisely in the middle of the production of the spaces, we were thinking of this presentation. We were thinking about this strategic autonomy that film, video need, even in the middle of a narrative of the collection. No, and we were thinking a lot about which should be the case study to also talk about how the collection has been made. No. Because our museum was never looking at inside in a sense, no? Was always running in fugue, let's say, of itself. And I think it's really interesting that, our conservators suddenly thought about La Imagen Sublime, the sublime image. That was the first exhibition of video art ever made in Reina Sofia in the '89. It was not even a museum, it was an art center at the moment. But that was, as it was produced by the Ministry of Culture at the moment, and I think we had a lot of money at the moment. The museum produced 30 pieces by really important people like Eugenia Balcells, Antoni Miralda, Muntadas, like a really key figures of contemporary art at the moment of Spain, and with a reasonable amount of money for the artists. And these pieces should appear directly. The contract was saying that the pieces should be in the collection. But as the museum was not born, nobody made the thing. I mean, so only some, translation. So the exhibition copies were there, but couldn't be used. Were like documentation in a kind of a limbo of the institution. I think these things are really interesting to talk about. So we made all the gestions with all the artists that are still alive, at least, for the pieces to be finally part of the collection and will be exhibited in this kind of library room that we are thinking about for the future. No? In this sense, I always say, I was remembering that we're talking about the objects and the objectifying of these things, and I love to think how these contemporary pieces finally in a collection at least like ours, finally stubbornly became subjects that have their own opinions, interpolate the institution in a lot of different ways, even in the sense of administration. That thing is really managerial. No, it's even important there, and not only because of the subjects, because of the subjects they deal with, because they have a voice. No, and the last thing I want to tell is precisely how this collection grows. This is one example of how the collection grows. Just to look at the archives and pull back, and rethink the ways we relation with things that should be already there. So this is a deep research process inside the museum. But the museum buys with the money of the state that we have as a museum, the autonomous law that protects that budget for us. Then we have some initiatives or transfers made by the Ministry of Culture because we just want to do something special or whatever, and we have this help to have more possibilities of acquisitions during the year. This is normally in a normal year around 3-4 million euros of public money in between Ministry and Museum, and then we have a double system of foundations. No, we have the Museo Reina Sofia Foundation in USA and the Fundación Museo Reina Sofia in Madrid, that precisely are two different structures of support for the institution, where circles of collectors support our acquisition system. And it's interesting that in there, the growing of video in the collector side, in the private side of help, is bigger than in the public acquisitions of the museum. This is really interesting. I don't know why, but it's true that I guess that a lot of collectors buy these pieces, they don't use them so much, and they want them in a museum to be used. No, I think the distribution process is also really interesting there. No, and in this sense, only two examples. One is the because it's here in a gallery, I think Elila, this Central American artist, Torita Encuetada, was given us by Mario Cader. That is one collector. Just put the example because this collector decided not to continue just giving pieces for the collection, but to open up the ways of production of the museum itself, producing for us an Institute of Central American Art that gets research, producing of exhibitions that we collaborated with TBA 21 for, and now for Ramirez Figueroa, for example. I mean, so we have a new institution inside the institution, but produced through the gift of a collector that also produces futures of the collection where video is really a central part. No? And then another example, just because it happened yesterday, that is like a collectors that decide, is like, hey, you have holes in your collection. I want to help here. And the last, precisely, I insist yesterday because we had a board yesterday of the foundation, and one collector from the Basque Country, Gabriel Calparsoro, decided to offer us one of the first Barbara Hammer pieces from the 73, really amazing one, precisely in the same sense. No? It's like, okay, we know what you're doing for the new collection presentation. This is a whole. You don't have lesbian gays in the 70s. You only have males. So let's go for this. And I think this is really also something really important because, I think we are all talking about interdependency, and the ways we can produce this ecosystem that the museum has. A museum as big as us has an ecosystem by itself, but also needs to be, permeated and porous to a lot of different situations.
Thank you very much, Manuel. And I just wanted to just put out on the floor that we're going to be expecting lots of questions, so we're going to start a chat here, but please start thinking. I wanted to perhaps talk about this idea of ownership, that you've spoken about it, you have spoken about it, and so have you. And to see, I'm just asking, is ownership an obstacle to collaboration? On the view of your platform, on exhibitions?
I'm not so worried about ownership per se. I'm sort of looking at the framing, that gives value to property, right? Which is, to me, a sort of a larger structure than the question of individual ownership. Right? By framing, I mean is that what defines sort of our ways of life, our ontologies, our epistemologies, and so on and so on. So if we move away, especially with moving image, right, that is a digital file these days, right? If we actually sort of start questioning a little bit this idea of the scarcification of, something that really can exist potentially in unlimited numbers, right? And also understand that perhaps this history of the propertization, especially of video and filmic work, really has, in my opinion, and they're much better experts in the room, has to do with somehow this approachment of artist cinema to the art market. Which is a historical fact, which is a development that happened at an opportune moment, at a moment where historically the art market became very strong, where film, video, and artist cinema production was just sort of the new medium that kind of entered that kind of realm and got really boosted. But it also then created a number of repercussions that we are sort of seeing today, and today being a moment where this sort of, where the art market and the funding, no longer as strong as we hope for. And what are the repercussions? One of the repercussions, I think, is that a lot of the productions became bigger and more ambitious, and 16-channel video and 12-channel audio and spatial configurations, which I'm not questioning per se, but it is not only something that is driven by sort of aesthetical considerations alone. It's also driven by the need to sort of create something that has more value, that can also compete within sort of an artistic and market field, where you have to differentiate and so on and so forth. And so all of that started to overshadow and erase other traditions, other possibilities of funding, of unionizing, of working together, of collaborating, of archiving, of collecting, of producing galleries, and so on and so forth. And of they still exist, right? And thank God they exist. I'm just saying there is a sort of a dominant tendency that came from a certain logic that has created, let's say, a direct relationship between filmic production, artist cinema, market, property, formats, collections, and so on and so forth.
So, Sandra, what do you say about
I think, Kadist, the way Kadist thinks is often thinking about the wholes, like what makes sense today. We were one of the first, collection buying video. We still buy video again. But we also felt the need at some point to find another system. We couldn't continue to buy works that were, again, 50,000, 80,000, 100. It was really, it didn't make sense. And I remember when I came with this project of licensing here, it was actually collectors who were a bit worried, and I understand that the licensing we were doing would diminish the value of the work. So licensing was a threat to ownership. the contrary, and the same for artists. Some artists were a bit scared. They were telling us, yes, but if I give you this work for licensing, then it means maybe a collector will not buy it anymore. And I understand it, but it's but that's I think we could do both, and Kadist tries to do both. We also produce work that then are given partly to museums. So the last work we co-produced of Éric Baudelaire was then acquired with our support at the museum, the Pompidou, Centre Pompidou. So it's an ecosystem. We have to work together.
I think that the example that you were mentioning earlier with Han Lefkens is just these 4 institutions co-owning a work as well.
Co-owning, everyone has his copy, so
exactly. So
it's not co-owned really. Everyone receives one edition, so it's
through your participation. Yeah.
So finally.
But why? Why don't you share a copy? Because
legally, a national collection like ours cannot. We cannot co-have.
Could you not?
No. Legally in Spain, that doesn't exist.
And is this something that you think could change? Should change?
I'm not so sure it's so interesting, frankly.
Okay.
Because for the artist, it's then giving 4 copies in one shot.
But it's $100,000 for production that I think they never get. I think it's an exceptional opportunity. We thought a lot about that. But mostly the thing is that these 3 editions, imagine, I don't know, I cannot remember, but it depends on the artist himself or herself. But the 3 editions come to the museums and then has more editions that can sell. You know what I mean? It's not that
like
that is
the
So I think it's Han has been doing this in different institutions for at least 10 years, I guess. MACBA has one also, for example, with MUAC, and I can't remember the third institution, no? M+, I think, is Hong Kong, no?
Yeah.
So it clearly works because it's a public convocatory and the artists participate. So I think, but anyway, talking about ownership, to be really brief, it's we are a national institution, so public service, so commoning is a part of the collection itself. So, we address the same things we are talking about, the contracts for the selling of video art of the 90s were never including licensing, or, there's pieces that we need to pay exhibition rights to show them, and they are belonging to the collection. So it's really weird, no? So these things were never done perfectly until the mid-2000s, professionally enough, or the questions were not given, so it's really interesting, no?
Maybe there's a smart contract specialist in the room, because that's really the last panel showed that, and I wish we could have discussed it a little bit more. If there's example of co-ownership through smart contract that could break the national.
They should know.
The experts.
Yes.
We do have examples of this co-ownership, this idea of collective ownership that it does exist. This is a project that we launched actually last week called Autonomous Forest, which is a land art project. So we have a forest outside Berlin, and it's managed through a DAO, through a decentralized autonomous organization, where you could buy NFTs that unlock both an NFT, a visual kind of traditional image, JPEG, and also membership to the DAO. And what it achieves through this double structure is the co-ownership of the forest, of the land and of the land art project. So examples of this is a kind of a mix between law and conceptual art in a way, and it's the smart contract is precisely written in this language for enabling co-ownership of a transnational group of people that co-owns something that exists in real life. So
in our case, the DAO could acquire the video pieces, and then each of our institution would get a share, a membership of the DAO.
Example, yeah, that could be one of the examples of seeing.
Heard it here first. And I wanted as well to touch upon this idea of care, and we're talking about care with the artist, to the work, to the process, and I'm interested in talking about care to the audience, which you, Manuel, did open your remarks on that vein, and I wondered if you would like to expand, Daniela,
Manuel, you start.
You're drinking your coffee.
I will say something really simple, but I always, since I became a curator in the beginning of the 2000s, I remember always making the same joke. I have some backache problems, and I remember this pipiloterist moment of the world, no? When to see a video piece, you always needed to lay in weird ways, on the floor, that the people that have a problem in the back are not comfortable anymore, no? A stupid thing as having cinema seats that are tested as comfortable for 100 years, no? I think is just, things like this is really stupid, but this comfortability, to summarize, there is a definition of the museums in the 18th century, so, when they were beginning, from the encyclopedic people of France that were telling that a museum is a monumental space that represents a state, that has this possibility of representing the state with this monumentality, but at the same time has the comfortability of the domestic space. It's a really bourgeois, proto-bourgeois romantic idea, but I think we need to go back to that, and also for cinema and video.
But I was just not so thinking so much about the physical aspects of it, which is very important, but more so with the caring for the audience in giving context of the artworks, just creating dialogues, facilitating direct contact with the artist, these education programs.
Yeah, but for Kadist, I guess I forgot to mention a key part of the care, the curator. No, I thought it was coming from curare, no?
No.
To cure? Curator?
No.
No. Okay.
No.
So
etymologist here.
I looked it up. It comes from crying more than from
crying.
Oh,
yeah.
wow, really? I never knew that. Fuck.
How that threw you?
Sorry, bad news.
And she didn't cry.
So
Well, it is suspected to come from, it's like etymology is.
Okay, let's say the curator care for the collection. Yeah. The way also at Kadist, the collection is made is by a number of advisors who are all curators, based in different parts of the world, and we all gather collectively and decide. Collectively, we vote. We can go back to that if that's of interest. But they're also the person who are in charge of the programming and making sure that when we do a screening in collaboration with in a space in Dakar or in Copenhagen, the works are well presented. To go back to Laura's comment from the first day, who as an artist, or Hito Sterl, who says be careful with the poor image. So the curator is the one who is responsible for the good screening and presentation of the work, but also responsible for the educational part of it, to make sure that there's a dialogue and there's a debate and there's something that creates a moment of conversation and transformation.
Because I wanted to perhaps ask you, Daniela, now that you've finished your coffee.
No, I'm happy to say, yeah.
How, because in Spain you've created a very strong arm in the organization, but you organize content-packed programs in Cordoba, and would you like to expand a little bit on that? If they cross over with what you're doing in Venice?
Well, I first wanted to answer it differently, because I see there at the very end of this room Stuart Connor, who I met yesterday again after many, many, many years, and it happened that we spent together the 1990s in Los Angeles, and at the time I was running an institution called the Max Center for Art and Architecture at the Schindler House. And I learned an invaluable lesson there, which I have always kind of kept with me as a curator. Because the Schindler House it looks a little bit like a Japanese pavilion, but kind of built out of concrete, or partially out of concrete, with sliding doors in the landscapes of Los Angeles. But what's so amazing in running this institution was that people would come in the morning, do their Tai Chi in the garden, then sit down in the back and read their newspapers, drink their coffee. It was really the first time I felt that an institution of art, right, does not need walls, does not need security, does not need guards, can actually function on the care of its audiences, right? So I'm almost inversing it a little bit. I feel sort of a little bit uncomfortable with this patronizing idea that as a curator, I care for you guys, you know? It's like, yes, of course, right? But in fact, you're giving us the generosity of your time, of your attention, of your interest, of your sort of being with the work, right? With all the things that we're sort of sometimes imagining over years that we'd like and desire and make sense and whatnot. And in a way, that's the sort of paradigm shift that I'd experienced first time in LA, was like, everybody who came to the Schindler House would pick up a piece of paper in what was in the garden, right? We, you know, would make sure that if somebody came too close to an artwork, you know, the person would say, "Oh, sorry," you know, like, this is an artwork. Right? Really, it was because you know, there were many reasons. Doesn't matter, but that's what I want to inverse a little bit. No, this idea that the institution then becomes again this isolate, right? So we're creating these caring environments of the museum as if the world out there wasn't horrible, violent, you know, disastrous, politically falling apart. Right? We're sitting in circles and holding hands. And I'm not against holding hands and not against yoga and all of that. I'm just sort of saying, as an institutional parameter, that doesn't work to me. Right? This is not, I mean, I know where it comes from, I appreciate it, but again, it's something we need to trouble a little bit, right? There is, and it's always been, institutions have to have the porosity of the world. And as curators, we have to understand that basically what is coming to us is the world. And what we can do is actually create forms of understanding, of asking questions, co-asking them and thinking together, rather than sort of creating an atmosphere where you come and everything is fine here and, you know, this is sort of the temple of aesthetics. Yeah?
That you're almost directed to do and behave in a certain way.
That's the worst part at the end, yes.
But with this, if you just almost took it out of my mouth, I think that we should be porous and open to the room for questions, because this is a luxury. So let's use these guys.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm a medical doctor, and at a certain point I switched from medicine to art. And so I have a different view about caring. It's not only about caring, you know, the works, the collections, the artists, but I think that art really cares. Yes, and I think that collectors who collect art, they are actually taking care of themselves, because art does them good. And I think this is one of the reasons we need to encourage collectors to collect more and more, because with art they're gonna, you know, have a better life. And so this, it's not about art therapy, but it's about, you know, for everybody and everyone. And last week, the Pope met in Vatican. He invited a number of people from the film, from the cinema world, and actors and filmmakers. And essentially his message was saying, you know, you as filmmakers and actors, you do good to the world, to everybody, because your art is very popular. And so I'm dreaming that next year, you know, Pope Leon will invite the people from video art.
From Loop.
And
yes,
you know, tell us that, you know, we are extraordinary artists, gallerists, collectors, because we do good to the world.
E.T.
And, you know, there is this woman that probably you all know, Rebecca Russo, who's a psychotherapist, and started to use video in her psychotherapies, and then even did some control studies to show how very concretely video art can help healing people faster who have some orthopedic problems, because it's moving images, and when you have orthopedic problems you need to, you know, start moving again. Well, I could tell you more for another hour, but I leave.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I think that that would be a fantastic idea for the board of these collectors that they are funding. We should invite this lady.
No, but maybe just to say one very brief answer to that. I never meant to say that art or a collection is not reaching inwards. That's what that's the paradigm I think we all sort of share, reaching inwards as in, inspiring, transforming, opening and whatnot. No? But I think the problem we have on a social scale, no, is how to actually sort of reach outward, and how to from a society, from a moment where everything is about this inward move, right? Everything is about subjectivity and reestablishment. Like, what's the other direction? Right? And this always changes, and it changes in different circumstances and different parameters, different institutions, and so on and so forth. And I think we need to find both directions: the inward reaching, the outward reaching, and creating the systems that allow both happening in parallel.
Thank you. I think there was another question.
Yes, thank you very much for the panel. It's very inspiring to listen to the three of you. I wanted to go back to one of the comments of Daniela about artist institutions. Especially, there are many archive, database, and so on and so forth that has been built by artists, but also by communities all around the world. And so I wanted to know how, with your three different institutions that are very different, I would say, scale, shape, way of working, you engage. I don't know if you want to use the word collective. I prefer the word custodianship, personally. Custodianship, right. That collecting, that because it's not about owning, but more about a certain ethics of care with the. In fact, the ethics of care, I think, is more involved with this body of work also. And it's so how do you involve with this work with custodianship when it relates to archive, where with artists or communities developing archive, database, and so on and so forth, and when it's not about leading to a work, an object, but like, and I give an example, on the one hand, I would say a queer community in San Francisco developing queer community archive, or an indigenous community on the other hand, with all the issues about preserving also the sovereignty of some community, the presentation, and so on and so forth behind. So, how do you engage with this in your institution? Do you think it's important today? Do you think it's part of collecting, so on and so forth?
Who would like to take this?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer. Well, in the case of TBA 21, I would say there is no, let's say, set up institutional mechanism to do so, right? It is a question that always lingers. It's this idea of giving back, right? This is the ghost that is kind of constantly hunting the practice. Like, how do you give back? How do you create kind of relationships of continuity, of endurance that last beyond the encounter, that last beyond, let's say, because I didn't talk about it, but we're very much engaged in commissioning and long-term commissioning projects and so on. So in a way, in most of the projects that we do, long commissioning commissioning ventures, there is always an aspect that is sort of thinking about this question of like, where do we operate? What is the community? How can we also create sort of systems of reciprocity, which do not sort of seem to be, again, like white savior type of thing, but creating sort of something from within institution that has some form of solidity and so on and so forth. And most often, as you were hinting at, the artist or the artist himself or herself, right, is sort of the main agent in negotiating that. Because they know, where and how and so on and so forth. Specifically during COVID, we had this platform called TBA 21 Stage, which still exists, but during COVID it was very much kind of entangled or very much sort of structured around questions of vulnerabilities in communities and artists that actually become the liaisons between those communities. They operate in COVID as this sort of time of utter injustice and destabilization, and how to create kind of institutional. But yes, to me, it's an extremely fundamental questions for all collections that operate sort of on a global scale, as we say, that operate with communities that, where works that are collected actually portray, certain relationships to communities and worlds and lands and whatever. And somehow this idea of how to then move from collecting, commissioning, object-based kind of reflection to engagement and durational relationships. Key question.
Yeah, I'll go back to the ecosystem and ways. Obviously, artist-led initiatives are so central, essential. So the way Kadist has done it for now is to partner with an initiative called Afield that Gregory knows well, to create a grant for artist-led initiatives, so and especially in visual art. So artists who have created a space for their own community, whether it's to show art or to create collective, to create an archive. And I was actually on a talk a few days ago by Ibrahim Mahama and
a fantastic school,
and Emily Jassier. So one creating many space in Ghana, and the other creating a very important space in Palestine. And they were both basically saying, in better words than I will translate now, but how much their practice is about caring for their community and bringing back to their community. And Kadist hasn't, so Kadist just do these grants. It doesn't impose a collection on those spaces, but obviously if we could be a resource for them, that would be, yeah, essential.
Thank you. Bye, you can.
This is where, yes. It's a question that is specifically for Manuel, but feel free also to address. I think it concerns all as well. And it relates to the fact that you're directing a public museum, and the situation in relation to public museums in Europe is or to contemporary art is changing radically. Now we see what's happening in Paris, where all these private foundations are radically changing the scene of the city, or in France generally, if we think of Luma and other places, and it connects also with the really high cost of certain artworks that I think as a public institution you either don't have the budget, or if you have it, maybe you don't want to give public money only for that, no? And so I was wondering how, again, it's a difficult question and probably it's impossible to answer, but how, as running a public institution and a public museum dedicated to contemporary art, are you navigating this transformation of a scenario where we have individuals or organizations who before would maybe be funders or friends of the museum and would dedicate their efforts and economic efforts as well to the museum, and now have decided to have their own space. And I think this is important if we want, and I profoundly believe in the public, if we want to continue that the public museum that owns works that at the end as taxpayers belong to us all, so there is a co-ownership at the end of it. How are you navigating that?
I think I explained it through the budget of acquisitions, for example. I think it's a good example. Manuel Borja Villel constructed a really interesting model, I think, learning from the one of Magba before, how these private foundations and articulations of private money through collectors can fit in the institution without belonging to the governance of the institution. The agency of the institution, Reina Sofia, is totally, like a public. I think this is a really, really important thing, distinction, with other models that we have in the country. And in this sense, the autonomous law of the museum and the way the Spanish state works right now warranties that the whole budget of the museum is totally public. You know, we don't need to find money to make things of the regular program of the museum. We need to find money to make extra things, or you know, like things that are maybe more expensive that what we can, you know, decide to make. But you know, like realistically enough, the 45 million euros that the museum costs in general, the 700 people that works there, opening it, you know, like the maintenance of the different buildings that we have 4 at this very moment, no, in Madrid. All of this is taxpayers' money, and this is the responsibility. You know, like so at the moment, nobody's telling us you should get more money back, you know, like or whatever. But there is something really interesting how the law works in our museum that I think shows you the difference with France. You know, like if we imagine that Kadist tomorrow, or TVA, for example, this happened with Naufus, want to help the museum, or you know, we are in a common project, and they want to help us pay in a show. Imagine, you know, I want to finance that project. If they don't pay directly the project by themselves, you know, for example, that happened with Naufus and the performance we produced, no, like for the exhibition in Madrid, they needed to pay directly to Naufus and the performers everything that happened. If the money is given to the museum, it gets to the account of revenue that goes directly to the state. We cannot use it. I mean, everything, at this very moment, we get 30% back, you know, like in between tickets and everything of what the state invests on us. And this money, at the end of the year, is for the state, like, okay, we are efficient, we get this money back. You know, if you get the 70, it's the same thing. We are not going to get more budget because we were efficient. You know, like I mean, so I think this shows you how we are warranted, and you know, like at least the model is like this right now. It can change, like we saw in the rest of Europe, really quickly. But I can tell you that at least these national monsters like us or Prado, I think it will be really, really difficult to change the model. You know, like you know, like I hope.
I would like, on that note, to sort of bring back the affirmation of Caroline saying, I really doubt that in 100 years' time there will be such a thing as a contemporary art museum. And I just thought of you. What do you think?
If they will last, you think?
Yeah.
I mean, you know, we were. I mean, I remember. Do you remember when DVDs were born? You know, like, and everybody's the death of. I mean, everybody's buying vinyls like crazy. You know, like. So I mean, I think, you know, books were dying. Everything is dying. Everything is ending. We need to learn from indigenous thinking. Everything is dying every month. No. So, I mean, I really think, you know, like during a time before we had ultra right wing all around Europe. We were thinking, you know, like our generations precisely were thinking like a museum, mausoleum, let's destroy the thing, like let's name our centers, Gonzales, let's change the name, they're not useful anymore, they're death institutions, they're from the past, 19th century, colonial, imperialist. And you know, like with the years, I think after precisely...
Now you're a director.
Yeah, no, but it's not because I'm a director, it's really important, it's because now we are having a system in the world where a lot of conservative forces are stealing words from us that we cannot use anymore, like freedom. You know, like a freedom became another thing, as we know. No, so I think this is really important. I'm really more into maintain, for example, the word museum and transform precisely how the museum works. And it's the artists that do that, you know, like the art practices, than to precisely it's like, okay, cancel, let's change the name. So I think museums have a long story to come. They're really young yet. And maybe they're starting. It's not even teenagers.
Great. Shall we have one more question then?
Yeah, I think but what Manuel just said will probably change what I want to say. I think, well, first of all, thank you for the panel and the remarks. I think what comes out of many of the experiences that have been shared today is that a medium that was born to disrupt the unicity of the object and also the scarcity of the circulation of art has generated a cohort of collectors who actually have as a priority the idea of sharing the work, and also the idea that caring maybe comes, and I borrow, of course, the vision of Beatrice Bulgari, for whom I work since 10 years, is that caring, first of all, and collecting, first of all, is about supporting the artist and supporting the production of new works. Both of your institution do this extremely well. And so this was maybe like something to comment together, but I really particularly like the quote that you shared about care being an activity that we perform to repair the world. But I think we have to start thinking more and more also how caring is a set of activities that doesn't perform new wounds that will then have to be repaired later. So maybe we should focus both on repairing, but also on not perpetrating the same mistake, I guess. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well,
Good
thank
ending.
Thank you very much, Manuel, Daniela, Sandra, and all of you for your participation and your attention. And there is, this is the last session for this year, but hopefully see you next year. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriela, and thank you all for staying with us. I would like to do a special thanks to Aitana Velez, who has coordinated the whole symposium, to our technical team, to the whole team of Loop. And do stay with us. There's plenty to see here. There's plenty to see across the city through Loop Festival that continues until Saturday. And yes, I hope we continue seeing each other these days.